Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. It's so great to see you. Thanks for being here. This session is SciComm training in the context of basic science. What do we need? I'm so excited to unpack this discussion today. We've had so many wonderful discussions about basic science communication and engagement generally, and how we train scientists or support and empower scientists to be effective communicators has been a big part of these discussions. And of course, training is a powerful way to do that. So we'll unpack that over the next hour in this session. So I'd like to invite up to the screen my colleagues who are going to participate in this session with me. And while they get their cameras on, I'll give a little background into what we'll be talking about today. So as I noted, science communication training is a really powerful way to empower scientists to be effective in their communications training. And one question that we've really had as part of our SciPEP endeavor is, when we are training scientists who identify as doing basic science or on the basic side of the spectrum, should we be thinking about what we're providing them in their communications training to be as effective as possible? Is it the same things that we provide any scientist, or there are special considerations that we should take into account for scientists to identify on the more basic side of the science spectrum? We actually here at the Kavli Foundation about 2 months ago hosted a small workshop to think through this and unpack some of these questions. And really the fundamental thread in that was, should there even be something different? Is what we're training in effective training programs sufficient, or is there something different we should think about? We actually started that session, and I mentioned this yesterday, and we've been polling people about this throughout this conference, asking the participants there, does this even matter? Is this a special consideration? If we're thinking about communicating in the context of basic science, are there things that should be different? Do we need completely different trainings? A few little tweaks made, or nothing needs changed? If it's an effective training program, it will work. And in that session, we had people with a number of different thoughts and opinions about that, which was really exciting to think about that richness and complexity and diversity of perspectives on that. So in this session today, we're going to unpack some of that. We're going to talk about a few key factors in communication training that make them effective, and then think about, does this matter or not when working with basic scientists? So I've got 4 main thrusts that we're going to talk about in this session, but please put your comments and questions in, and we'll incorporate them into those main themes, and then we'll have open time at the end of the session. So to get started, I first would like to welcome and thank these amazing panelists who are going to provide the substance and thought-provoking ideas into this session. I'm going to ask each of them quickly to introduce themselves, your name, your affiliation, what you do in your world that makes you part of wanting to contribute to a session like this. And I'd also like to hear from you when thinking about whether or not basic science or scientists who identify as basic science should have something unique or not in trainings. Where do you fall? They need something different. They don't need anything different. Maybe something in the middle. Would love to hear just where you land on that spectrum as we get this conversation going. Laura, can we start with you for introductions, please?
Sure. I'm Laura Lindenfeld. I'm at Stony Brook University. I am the Dean of the School of Communication and Journalism, and I'm also the Executive Director of the Alda Center for Communicating Science, which gets to the next question you asked us. What I do is I run an organization that helps scientists become outstanding communicators. Where do I fall on this spectrum? This is a complex question. I think everything needs more strategy, but I do believe there are some things that may be different depending on the strategy and the audience.
Thanks, Laura. Anthony.
Thanks, Brooke. Hi, my name is Anthony Dudo. I'm an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm in the College of Communication here, and I research and teach science communication. I'm also the program director of our Science Communication Research Lab, which is part of a research center we have here called the Center for Media Engagement. So I've done a lot of multi-method research on scientist communicators over the years, and specifically on the stakeholders like trainers and fellowship programs in that space. But in addition to the research side of things, I also teach here at UT, and I teach science communication courses to undergrads and also to STEM graduate students and postdocs. So regarding the question of whether there's anything special or different when it comes to training basic scientists, I'm actually going to withhold my opinion at the moment because I'm going to talk about that in just a second when I have more mic time. And I'm going to actually do something that I know a lot of folks are doing yesterday that I really enjoyed, which was sharing their favorite, piece of science literature or sci-fi entertainment media, whatever. And I'm going to do a quick shout out to my favorite book of all time, not just science fiction book, which is Contact by Carl Sagan, and one of my favorite sci-fi TV shows of all time, which is the reimagined Battlestar Galactica.
That was my favorite one too, Anthony. I love that show so much. Okay, thank you. Claudia, welcome. Could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Claudia Fracchiolla. I am the head of public engagement at APS, which I think is one of the qualifications for being in this panel. But I think I have several faces that will fit here. So I started with high energy physics, which is considered a basic science. And then I switched to physics education research, which is more an applied science. And then I do research on discipline-based identity development in informal spaces. And at the APS, what we do is we work with our members to design projects that will support them to do their own public engagement activities. And before we design these programs, we have work on understanding their interests and needs and challenges so that the programs that we design are more fitted to our members and how we work with them. In terms of where I fit, so I think that I would say it's more on like topic consideration rather than specific basic versus applied. And I would say, like, for example, quantum, as we're gathering for International Year of Quantum, that is something that it's a lot on my mind, and it's different to train people to talk about quantum than other topics for multiple reasons.
Thank you. Claudia, can you say what the APS is? Can you just define your acronym for everybody?
We can type it on the chat, but it's the American Physical Society. So I work with physicists.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Bruce. Hi, welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bruce Lewenstein. This year marks 35 years that I've been teaching science communication at Cornell University in the United States. And actually, for even longer than that, I've been doing research in the field. Despite the claim in one of the intro videos that we've got 2 decades worth of research. We've got a lot more than 2 decades worth of research, although I will admit it's picked up recently. As I said in the chat yesterday, I think that the basic applied question is actually the wrong question to ask, but I'm going to hold off on more about that until we get later.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, so the 4 threads that we're going to cover here in this session are about how goal setting and communication training relates to training in a basic science context, how core competencies in science communication, what are they and how they may relate or not in a basic science context. This question of, is it basic science that we are supporting people to learn how to communicate, or is it scientists who identify with basic science that we are supporting? And then lastly, we'll unpack this question of relevance and how that shows up in training. So that's what you can expect in this next 50 minutes or so. And we're going to start with goal setting. So for each of these questions, one of our great speakers here has some deep expertise in it, and I'll ask them to start with some remarks that will take a few minutes, and then others will have a chance to respond. So it'll be a bit of a foundational remarks followed by a discussion. So for goal setting, I'm going to invite Anthony to get us started. Anthony's done a lot of work with some of his colleagues, and you heard from some of them yesterday, like John Besley, in thinking about how to set strategic goals and why that's really important in science communication, and has done a lot of surveys of scientists to understand their goals in science communication. And recently, John and Anthony did a survey that was briefly talked about yesterday of scientists who may identify more on the basic side of the spectrum and what their goals may be. So Anthony, we'd love to hear from you about how goal setting shows up in science communication training. Is there anything special that we might consider when doing it or thinking about it in the basic science context?
Great. Thanks, Brooke. I appreciate it. So I have maybe 4 or 5 minutes worth of responses to these glorious questions. I'm going to take the first 2 minutes, though, I want to provide a little bit of, I want to make sure we all have some shared knowledge about science communication training. I know the focus is on basic to applied, and I'm going to get there really quickly, but I just want to make sure we all have that kind of shared understanding. So let me start with some key insights from our data. And again, I'm referring to our data collectively, other folks in the space, many of whom are presenting in this conference, where we've dug in and we've taken a look at not only scientists and strategy and goal setting, but also the stakeholders who support them. So in terms of the scientists, one of the big kind of take-home messages we found from our data is that scientists often have come to communication with a narrow view of what communication looks like. And it tends to be often focused on tactics. How do I design a message? How do I distribute that message, et cetera? And we also found, again, continued evidence of some, I'll call them unhelpful assumptions about the relationship between communication and human psychology, right? A la the deficit model. And that's the last I'll mention that. We've also seen this among these kind of same trends among a lot of the folks in the science communication training space. And keep in mind, a lot of this research is focused on trainers and organizations that are based in the North American landscape. We found that curricula often has a narrow focus that tends to look a lot at tactics. So things like, how do you tell better stories? How do you use social media? How do you create a podcast? How do you get rid of jargon? And we've also observed kind of I'd consider, frankly, a false friction between creativity and strategy. That is, this idea that having strategy is going to somehow constrain creativity or fun, when really good strategy can help maximize creativity and fun, I would argue. And we've also found that a lot of the staff and the folks and the trainers in the space often don't have backgrounds. They don't come to those places with a background in strategic communication. Often it's someone who's in STEM that's moving into that space, or someone maybe from a different area of communication, like journalism, who's in that space. And so what does this mean? Frankly, it leads us to the impetus for this coming together at this actual conference, right? Because we have opportunities to grow, evolve, and improve our collective efforts to support science communication. And this really does feel like an opportunity to me and not a problem, because I think a lot of us can sense and see this almost insatiable appetite among this ecosystem, right? To dig in, innovate, collaborate, experiment, fail, and go again. And I also would say in the last 5 to 10 years, I think a lot of those data points that I was just suggesting to you earlier, we're actually starting to sense and feel some shifts, which is great. But okay, the next question, and the one that I think that really underlies this session, do our efforts to help scientists become more effective communicators, whether that's more strategic, more goal-oriented, do they need to be designed around a difference between basic and applied researchers? My answer to that is sorta, kinda, not really. And so I was thinking, like, how do I walk through this in a way that's not too wonky and boring? And I had this idea when I was walking into campus this morning in my office, and I saw it's summertime. And so we have a lot of campus tours for prospective, either students that are coming or students that are thinking about coming next year. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, that might be like a really good metaphor for how I feel about this question. So bear with me for a second. I hope this resonates. So I mentioned earlier that I'm faculty in the College of Communication. Our college, we have 4 buildings. We're in the northwest corner of campus. And, the tour we offer to prospective students, it's the same tour if looked at a high level, right? Each tour shows all the attributes of our college. We're going to show the lecture halls. We're going to show the green spaces, the cafes, the study areas, you name it. But if you look more closely, you'll see that the tour guides start each of these tours, right, by learning about their tourists. What are their potential majors? What are their potential interests? What are their lived experiences? And then they tweak their tours accordingly. For example, right, a tour guide might linger longer in a filmmaking studio if some of the prospective students indicate that they want to become an RTF major. Great. But each tour is still always going to show our lovely filmmaking studios, right? So in other words, we're offering the same tour, but we're tweaking each one to meet the needs of the prospective students. We're not offering 5 or 10 fundamentally different tours depending on what major these students want. And there's strategic reasons for why the tours are done this way. And I think they map really well into this discussion potentially. Why not? Because they would require too many resources is one compelling reason. But another is because doing so would actually constrain our college's ability to achieve the fundamental goal of the touring program, which is to impress upon these students that UT is great and that our majors are great and that we're going to provide them a welcoming, professional, inspiring atmosphere so that they'll ultimately choose to enroll at UT and enroll in our college. Okay, so what's the take-home message from this metaphor for our context of science communication training? Here's my answer to that original question you posed, like, where are you on the spectrum now? So here it is. I think the notion that basic and applied scientists, need different communication training may be a bit of a straw man. I think it's more a matter of having, training that has increasingly clear and comprehensive learning objectives and curricula, and that centers their trainees in ways that acknowledge that each trainee's journey through the training will be different. It's not unlike inclusive pedagogy in teaching. And it may very well be that a basic scientist, for example, may need more help understanding the value of, say, setting communication goals, but so can an applied scientist, and we want to be ready for that. In this case, I think what's really important are actually the skills of the trainers themselves, namely that they can be teachers who excel at connecting the content to the needs of each student. And with that, I've spoken enough, and I hope that I've maybe teed up Bruce to talk a little bit about core competencies.
Thank you, Anthony. Yeah, we'll get to the core competencies next. I want to pause and invite any perspectives or reactions to that, and also want to acknowledge there is a question that Keegan brought forward from the last session that might be relevant here, where someone asked whether or not we should be training scientists in these fields to do engagement about their topics specifically as maybe a level down in terms of like, yes, we're talking about UT Austin, but where do I talk about my film school and where do I learn how to talk about the film school? So that might be relevant here. So reactions or thoughts to Anthony's comments?
I can chime in a bit. So yes, I 100% hear and support what Anthony said about you need to listen first. And actually that is one of the things that we emphasize in all of our trainings, right? The first thing that you need to do is listen. And this is particularly important when it comes to addressing misinformation, but also when we are helping our physicists or APS members design these projects, the first questions that we ask are all reflective questions about why do you want to do this? Who do you want to engage and why? What are these people's needs and interests? Why are you the right person to address those needs or engage with these audiences? Because then your goal should be oriented in the audience that you want to reach. And I'm a huge believer of participatory engagement, which means that you bring your audiences in and you kind of co-design together. And I know this is not possible in every program that you design or engage in, but you can still bring them in some forum and gather information before you design your programs to make them more effective and to make them feel also that you care about their voices, because then that will build long-lasting relationships and interest more than, I think that optics is so cool and lasers are super cool and I just want everybody to like lasers and kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Claudia. Laura, Bruce, anything to add before we move into core competencies, which is quite relevant to this too? Okay, let's dive into that. So I'm going to turn it over to Bruce, who, in addition to his decades of experience that we've acknowledged and applauded in our chat, has also very recently published a paper with some of his colleagues about core competencies in science communication. And this is a great framework and structure in which to think about what are we bringing to science communication trainings. And then, of course, the question here for you, Bruce, is does that framework get tweaked or applied or thought of any differently when working with scientists who identify as doing basic science in a training? Bruce, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Brooke, and thanks for inviting me. As Brooke said, I'm reporting on a paper that my colleague Ayelet Baram-Sabari and I recently published, and she's a professor of science education at the Technion Israel Institute of Technology. What she brings is an education theory perspective to things that we've studied together, and I think that's an important point. I have put both the paper and a set of slides that touch briefly on the highlights somewhere in the Knowledge Hub. I'm not sure how to get to it, but it's there somewhere. And I will later put some citations in the chat. As Anthony said, a lot of scientists don't know anything about communication theory. And it turns out that most of us who are involved in training don't know much about education theory. I'm sorry, they don't know about comm theory. most of us in training don't know about education theory and what it takes to really think strategically and carefully about education. So let me talk about that. I don't think there's a lot of difference between basic and applied, but I will say a little bit more about that at the end. So here are some of the things that we had in the paper. First off, we talked about the issues of communities of practice. Who are we trying to train? We broke it into 3 categories: the occasional science communicators, the active science communicators, and the professional science communicators. So the occasionals are the grad students in labs who are told one day, you're going to the mall next weekend for demo day. And they don't know anything and they need to know something a little bit. Or a scientist who's not very engaged, and then some piece of their research gets picked up for media purposes and suddenly they have to engage. Those are occasionals. The active people are the ones who have decided to commit a part of their career to regular public engagement. Maybe they have a blog or they run a citizen science project, but they still consider themselves primarily researchers. And then finally, there are the professionals, the people who have said, yeah, I'm leaving the lab behind. I'm going into science communication as a career. I'm thinking of people like my former student, Shannon Brescher-Shea, who works for the DOE's Office of Science and who is online today. Hi, Shannon. Or to people like Jeannie Garbarino, who we heard yesterday, who works at Rockefeller University, a basic science institution. We talked in the paper from Education Theory about what does it mean to learn science communication. And we talked, it was based on a paper or on a report we did for the National Academies 15 years ago. I'll put that citation in. But the key thing was you think about issues like excitement, which is often what basic science people want to do, the content of what people have to learn, the methods for communicating, reflecting about what you're doing in science communication. And I think that's a key one, practicing, and then your identity. We talked about what we called threshold concepts: deficit versus dialogue, co-production of science and society, trust. We talked about learning progressions, the idea that you learn in a spiral and you come back to what you've learned before. And this gets to a question from the last session about whether that was in the chat, about whether one-off trainings really work when you do need to keep coming back. From communication theory, we talked about what's called the web of science communication. Basically, it's just the idea that information doesn't flow in one direction, but it flows in multiple directions. Perhaps the best example here is this week's blockbuster film, Oppenheimer. Sorry, I don't have any Barbie references. But the attention on nuclear science, basic science, was driven by social needs, societal needs. So information flows in both directions. And finally, we think that science communication training needs to think a lot about what I'll call STS theory: science and technology studies, history and sociology of science. It's perhaps not irrelevant that my PhD is in history of science, where we think about things like the social construction of knowledge, where values are important. And again, Rick brought this up yesterday at the end of the day. And where a key question is, what is science? Science is, it's about, sometimes when we say science, we mean a body of knowledge. Sometimes we mean the practices of science or the process of science. And sometimes we mean the institutions. And so this is my final point. I know I'm running long, which is linking social construction of knowledge with what is science. This is the problem of basic versus applied, because what STS theory tells us is that this is just the wrong question. The same work can be both basic and applied. So think about the Manhattan Project again. It's a great example. What we need to teach is that the distinction between basic and applied is essentially a rhetorical and a political choice about whether to call something basic or applied. If you want funding, you talk about how the potential applications. We heard that in the intro remarks from Dr. Friend and Dr. Berhe this morning. If you want to avoid regulation or oversight, you talk about how what you're doing is basic and fundamental and doesn't have any immediate implications. Again, we think about the Kavli funding of centers on ethics. So for application and the need for independence are true, but you choose which label to use based on your audience, or as John and Anthony would say, based on your strategic goals. I think what we need to do is train everyone, occasional, active, and professional, to understand that. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruce. Laura, if I could put you on the spot, I'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions to this, especially as someone who has trained, and your organization has trained scientists who identify all on the entire spectrum in the medical sciences, in math, you run the gamut. So in practice, in working with different disciplines that might identify in a different place of the spectrum, what are your thoughts and responses to Bruce and what Anthony said earlier too?
Bruce, this paper that you and Ayelet wrote, it was fascinating to me. When I read it, I realized we'd created an infrastructure in the Alda Center and the School of Communication and Journalism with programs that map exactly onto those three levels. So thank you for the thank you for the theoretically based description of what we intuited was necessary. Brooke, I'm just going to speak briefly to this right now, but I think this piece about relevance that we discussed yesterday and today is so important here. And Bruce, I love how you frame this and how you bring the rhetorical aspects of this into play. If we think about science communication and strategy more broadly, I'd like to see us map similarly that Bruce and Ayelet laid out. I'd like to see us map training to strategy more broadly, because you may have, and I don't think we always do that systematically. I think we have a lot of grow your own and here's a need, let's be responsive to that. And I'd like to think about, Claudia, your example of quantum, where there's basic and applied, or I saw a comment earlier here, I think it was from Rick, that even if you're an applied scientist, you may have times when you have to communicate about the basic research that led to the applied science. So I think we're troubling this question a little bit here on this panel. And I think science communication training at large and research, and I'll talk more about this later, I'm going to wrap up in a sec here, really needs to be strategically responsive to the gamut of questions that we have as a society around where we need better engagement and therefore communication.
Thanks, Laura. Anthony, Claudia, anything you want to add to this? Okay. A lot of folks are putting in some great resources in the chat, including the paper Bruce mentioned and others. And there's some down, if you scroll down your screen, some of the things that are in the Knowledge Hub are specifically there too. Okay, I'm gonna shift gears a little bit, and I see some great questions coming through, so excuse me, we'll get to those in a minute. Claudia, I wanna talk a little bit about your work that you do at the APS. As you mentioned in your introductory comments, especially being a society predominantly of physicists, many of whom identify more on that side of the spectrum, which I say with caution after Bruce's comments. Thank you, Bruce. One of the programs you specifically have is to help scientists, members of the APS, think about how to engage and communicate around potentially controversial issues, whether or not that's vaccines or climate. And I share those examples because, as I understand it from you and your team, many of those examples are not about the science that the members that you're supporting are working on themselves in their labs and their research. And so it's this really interesting perspective that I think you have of working with scientists to identify in their own research on the basic side, but to engage in conversations about science and culture that aren't necessarily about their science, but are about science and most likely a lot of the more applied science. And so I'm wondering if you can share some perspectives you have about that idea of training the scientists to be powerful communicators around any topic, versus when you train and support scientists to talk about some of the more fundamental research that might happen. Oh, you're muted, Claudia. And if you're not, we had this problem before, we just might need her to refresh her page. We'll give her 1 second. Great.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
I don't know why it switches. So the project you're referring to is the Science Trust Project. And the main goal of that project is to build capacity in our members to address misinformation in science. And we don't have a specific stage for them to like, you can find misinformation in science and anywhere, like conversations with your family, neighbors, or maybe a public talk or something like that. So we really focus on the methodologies of how to do that, and also a bit of the psychology of misinformation and how is this slightly different than maybe training how to communicate in other mediums. So as you said, we use climate change right now as the topic that we center to provide examples, but methodologies are transferable. But we actually started this project back in 2020 because our members felt like they needed to do something about the misinformation in vaccine. And we ran our first pilot about this topic. And the main feedback that we got was, well, we don't really feel comfortable about talking on vaccines, even though research shows that, other people will be more open to hearing information about vaccines from a very well-informed neighbor or friend than from experts in itself, because there's this trust issue with not necessarily scientists, but as was mentioned yesterday, institutions and things like that. So we changed to climate change for those reasons. And we use actually the definition of science as the processes, right? And the practices when we start introducing the 4-part training, because then that leaves them to feel, okay, I'm an expert on that, right? Like, even doesn't matter what my research area is, I am an expert on the practices of science and discovery. So it sets them to feel more comfortable about a topic that is not their own. Now, something that we've noticed that, it's very common, I am at fault of that, is that we scientists get trained as okay, misinformation, how do we address it? We just throw facts at people, right? We just list citations and show them proofs of things. And actually, after we started learning more about the psychology behind misinformation and how actually it is very attuned to people's identities, values, and belief, that throwing facts is actually making them shut down in a communication channel, right? Like, you immediately, as you do that, then, people just completely disengage. And so what our members are trained to automatically do is the opposite of what we should be doing, which is as Anthony said at the beginning, we need to listen, right? And some of the methodologies that we teach are specifically centered around reflective listening, understanding people's identities, and how to engage in those conversations, because the first step is just building that trust and that relationship. And then through that, then, you get open communication. So it's kind of also going back to the goals, what the goals should be. We state very clear, your goal should not be changing people's minds, because one-off interactions is not going to be making that. But it should be more centered around building that trust and that communication.
So a question for you and others on the heels of this, in terms of following up on what you were saying about it's not just throwing facts at people, and that might be what the assumption is coming into this from your membership. If we're talking about this core skill of listening, which is a core skill of any communications in any context, whether it's science or something else, one of the questions I have for this panel then, as we drill down into helping support a physicist or a mathematician to learn that skill in their work versus, let's say, a clinical researcher Do you think there's a difference between those two? And so this is where it comes into, like, as we get deep into the training, like, yes, people need to listen, great. But when we really sit down with a room full of APS members versus maybe another society, might there be differences in how we do that? What does that look like in your experience?
100%. And you know, like you mentioned, the health careers, and they actually have that in their training, right? Like anybody who goes through any of the different disciplines of health, like public engagement is part of the things that they learn in their career. It's part of their curriculum, which I argue often, and as an APS, as an organization, tries to advocate that public engagement should be also a practice that physicists do. And this is not, you know, on our research, we have seen that especially students on early career physicists experience that they are discouraged to do this. But, you know, you have to, like, when we teach, we are communicating science there, right? Maybe it's a different setting, yes, but like the methodologies will work the same way. Writing grants or anything like those formal things that we are required to do if we are on an academic path require techniques that are included in the public engagement and science communication training. So it should be part of the things that we include in the curriculum.
Yep. Laura, Anthony, Bruce, anything to add to this?
So I was just going to jump in. This is actually related to something that's in the been in the chat, which is the evidence that shows that if you learn to engage and you engage, your own science will end up better. Certainly, it will be cited more. And if we hope that that means that people are engaging with it and doing work, it is, you know, many of the skills about active listening and about being able to express yourself clearly will be useful to scientists, no matter where in their careers they're using them, whether for public or for teaching or for talking to other scientists at meetings, which suggests, again, as some of the comments have said, that what we need to be doing is building this kind of training or education throughout someone's academic training, undergraduate, graduate, postdoc, and this also gets to the one-offs don't work, right? That it's got to be something that they repeat over and over. And then you can have a specialty one where, you know, if you work in nanoscience, here's a particular set of things that are particular to nanoscience. If you work in genetically engineered crops, here's a different set of issues you may need to think about. But we're not trying to do it all at once. We're doing it building on other things. And so for the applied person, there's one set of things. For the person who says, I'm a theoretical mathematician, that's all I'm interested in, there's a different set of things to talk about.
Thank you.
Can I
Laura, did you have something to? Oh yeah, Anthony, go ahead.
Laura. I
No,
want to piggyback on Bruce real quick before I forget what I was going to say, which was, you know, so some of the research we've done, we've looked at that, you know, training, which we would kind of operationalize as being more of a quicker interaction, whether it's a 2-hour training or a 2-day training, versus communication fellowship programs, which in some cases can last a year, right? And one of the things that we saw as kind of a difference between those two things is one of the deficits in training was that often you'd see training that would allow scientists to practice what they were learning, but not to actually perform what they were learning. And those things are different. Whereas in fellowships, what you would often see is you'd see experiential learning, you'd see situated learning where the scientists were actually able to, over time, practice and perform what they were learning. So, you know, that just speaks to the notion of the training playground being broad and needing different types of training for, you know, different types of thing. And I immediately go back to thinking about the fundamental aspects of Bruce and Eilet's paper, which is this notion of investment from the scientist communicator in the communication, their experience level and what they need.
Thank you. Okay, I know Laura has some thoughts about this that are also relevant to our last topic on relevance. So let's move to that and we'll hear from you, Laura. Okay, so our final topic before we dive into some of the other questions that have come up is this idea of relevance. So we know in trainings, a really critical thing to do is to support participants to think about their audience and how to make what you're trying to do and your information and your goals relevant to them. We had a whole session about this yesterday in terms of how we've grappled with relevance in basic science as utility. A utilitarian frame tends to be a dominant one and doesn't need to be. And so, Laura, I'd love to hear your thoughts about, through your experience and your work, when you think about supporting scientists to be strategic about their relevance and explore what the relevance is. What has that looked like, and have you observed or seen differences on scientists who identify more on the basic side of the spectrum?
I'm going to skirt the last part of that question for now, but I'll try and come back to it. Let me step back and just talk about what drew me to the Alda Center to begin with. And it was that the Alda Center was using improvisational theater to help scientists, and I mean that broadly, STEM and health professionals, learn how to listen, connect, and develop empathy with the audiences they serve. And when I first came in, and Anthony, I know you and John have written about this, and appropriately so, I think that what was strategy. So we had this really nice theatrically based way to help people learn how to connect and listen and identify relevance. I don't think we were as strong, but I do think we've really focused on and built capacity around to what end and then for whom. So that we now are really focused around building those connection and empathy muscles through improv. And I'm not talking about stand-up comedy. I'm talking about developing genuine connections and really kind of a deep investment in dignity and humanity. Thanks to those of you who gave shout outs about your relationship with the Alda Center and Stony Brook. I'm just so glad to see folks here who've had an experience with us. So really, one of the core things we're doing is helping people to train that responsiveness muscle. Who am I connecting with? To what end? Why am I having this conversation? Why am I tweeting? Why do I want to get involved in the production of this movie? And what is it that I need to bring to this conversation so that I can be relevant and responsive to this audience's needs, given who they are and what they care about? Really, any of you have done the training with us, and I know, Brooke, you've been through this a number of times. You've seen it. Anthony, you as well. I really think that's in a core fashion what we're after. So I want to come back to a question you posed right before and make a tie to that, and that was about, someone who may be working on the healthcare spectrum as opposed to basic. The goal is different, and we actually have that here. So we have a healthcare approach led by Dr. Sushmita Poti. She's our senior medical advisor, and she's developed this training that's really about team resilience and outcomes for patients and their families. That's a really different goal of having a team feel that they can work together, be responsive to each other, and always have the goal of making sure the patient gets the care that they need. That's really different than trying to persuade someone to invest money in your research. Many of the tactics that we use, and Anthony, I see you nodding, many of the tactics that we use, learning to be responsive in that setting are the same, but the outcomes we're seeking are different. So the second point I want to make, and I have three, so I made the first one already about our training's already focused on relevance and responsiveness. It's just baked in. The second one is that I think we really need to think about training as a broader system. I've written some about this. Anybody who knows me knows I love to talk about and think in systems. But where do we have gaps? Do we have enough healthcare team resilience training that links to science? Is there enough out there? Do we have enough training around people who want to connect with policymakers and that whole world? So I'd like to see us work more collaboratively to design what's needed and for whom, under what circumstances. Rick, you had a comment in the chat before about how so much training is in specific areas of science as opposed to across. We're really, to us, it's irrelevant what area of science you come from into a basic Alda training. As we get into more specific targets, audiences, goals, complexities around science, that matters more. But this fundamental training around connection, empathy, and relevance to me is a very similar process. And then the last piece, this was in the description for the session, and we haven't talked about it, but I think it's really important, is assessment and evaluation. Are we achieving what we're setting out to do? Is it making the difference we seek? Are we creating a backfire? Is it neutral? Is it positive? Is it productive? So everything that we're doing at the center, we're attaching assessment, some of it really quite serious, multi-year, empirically based, conducted independent of us, to really say, are we doing what we should be doing? What could we be doing better and differently? So I would love to see us have a broader map that links training to strategy, and that is consistently feeding back so that we understand at the more global level what's missing, what do we need to be doing more of, and then specifically in a given training experience or session, what's working, what's not, and how can we do better so we can hold ourselves accountable to high standards, which are important.
Okay, I'm going to draw from a couple of the questions here to make sure we cover a few of these, which will relate to, and we can build in some responses to your great comments, Laura, and the responses. There's this question here that says, how do you communicate science to earn general public's trust? And I hear this all the time, especially from basic scientists. Like, I feel like I should go talk to my science. I don't think people trust us, and I want them to trust us. What are your responses to that general idea and this specific question? I think all of you have experience in this. Who wants to start? Maybe Anthony, you.
I'll start real quick, because
yeah.
Actually in my intro to science communication class that I teach here at UT, we devote 2 weeks to this issue of trust in science. And we've seen some data yesterday on this, and it's obviously very timely. And I've heard that same question before from scientists, from student scientists, et cetera. And I just want to point out and get a little social sciencey here for a second. I want to point out that the concept of, there are people who have studied the concept of trust for their entire career, and they debate about trust. And one thing that kind of comes out about it, and I'm not an expert in trust, but trust is a multi-dimensional concept, right? Scientists have tons of capital in the bank when it comes to credibility. Where they don't have tons of capital in the bank is when it comes to warmth and relatability, which in the context of science communication may matter a lot more than credibility in some situations that we're finding. And so that's something that I just want to point out when we talk about this notion of trust in science. And if you can connect the dots and you think about what Laura was just saying about how it's fundamentally important as a foundational level of training is to help scientists understand better who they are within the context of communication so that they can be more human, more relatable, more authentic, and build that connection. You can't have meaningful information exchange in any context if you don't first have trust with your communication partner. That's why that's so important to this context.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
would add to that I mentioned already the fact that we need to listen first. We need to ask questions, but humility is something that we scientists need to learn more, and not assume like the other person or whoever audience you're engaging to, they are bringing they are experts on some other stuffs too. So respecting that and giving them the chance that, you might have a lot of expertise on some specific topics, but, don't assume that these persons comes with no knowledge. And so humility and respect are huge to build trust and communication channels.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Bruce, I want to ask you this.
I was going to make one quick point, just to absolutely, plus one to what I just said, and to the fact that Laura introduced this. But the other aspect of this is that trust takes time. It's not, I'm going to walk into a room and I'm going to build trust today. This is a critical part of helping people understand that this is an ongoing process that takes time to develop, can be years. Again, Jeannie talked about this yesterday when she talked about working with different communities.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really important point that it's ongoing. I feel like sometimes in my conversations with scientists on this, it's almost like it's the destination. Okay, great, we're finally there. They trust us, I'm good. And now I can go back to just doing what I was doing. Okay, I just want to ask Bruce quickly this question that came from Keegan. She noted that yesterday Chris Volpe talked about how scientists who are more process-oriented, process-minded versus payout-minded, and along that scale. And she's curious, are there parallel discussions in education theory that might extend to different ways learners view science?
So I really have to ask Ayala that because she knows the theory better than I do. You know, the basic thing is we know there are different kinds of learning, and those of us who, you know, what is different about somebody asked what's different about training in science communication than just training in communication. What's different about teaching one subject versus another? All of us who have been at a university for a while have been started to learn about active learning and teaching and responding to different kinds of learners. And that's certainly going to be true, I think, for scientists, both as how they learn science communication, but also as to what kind of science communication is going to work best for them. So I think this is again speaks to why we have to think about this when we're planning our trainings, so that we recognize that, so that we have a menu. So if you really want to focus, if you think visually, you know, here's a training for you. If you think in equations, here's a way for you to adapt. So I think we do need to pay attention to that.
Okay,
Brooke,
thank you.
If I can build on that really briefly, just thinking about trust and science communication training and audiences, and who you are as a scientist or communicator, there's also just so many different environments in which we communicate, ranging from face-to-face to written to, you know, being someone who's part of a screenplay, but you're never actually appearing in the movie, to communicating in social media. And I think this need to be really strategic about science communication training and understand where there are gaps has to take those platforms into account as well. So that scientists who are engaged at some point, whether it's them directly on camera or feeding into something that goes on camera, are prepared for working in that context. And so that means we need to get ahead of the game and develop trainings for what's to come. Think AI. It's here. It's going to be more and more. We're not ready for that.
Okay, this is probably our final question, and then some closing thoughts if we have time. Keegan acknowledged that in the previous session, Ray, who spoke in that session, was advocating for an experimental space for communication of basic science so we can learn more about it. And curious if we could bring that concept over to this conversation. If we were to have a more experimental space for parts of communication training that might apply a methodology a little bit differently if you're working with a basic scientist versus an applied scientist, what might be something on your wish list that we would do in that experimental space so we could learn more about how it works? You might need a minute to think about it, but who can jump in?
I'm going to take I'm going to take a lesson from the scientists. Well, what we need is funding. Because what we need, because those of us who are teaching science communication or building these programs, we are often stretched, right? Laura is really lucky. She's got a center. She's not lucky. She's worked really hard to build a center and to build a funding model that works so that she can offer more. What we need is, you know, those of us who are teaching also teach introductory communication theory classes or other things. What we need is the space so that we can say, you know, I want to offer a week-long seminar or a 2-weekend seminar or something like that. And I want to do that without taking time away from my family and without taking time away from my other students who also have needs and so on. I think it's possible, but I think we actually need the resources as much as we need a conceptual space.
Thank you.
I would say even before then, right? Because to get the funding, we would need to have institution funders and, you know, even within the disciplines, cultural buy-in into investing money and time into this. So I would say, like, we need more advocacy to be able to make these spaces a reality, because right now I don't even think that we have enough support to get that. But then I'm assuming that this will be a thing in the future. I would say one of the first things is, like, how do we get scientists to first get off of that like hard structure that we all put ourselves? Like, I think I say it many times, I became a physicist because I didn't want to deal with people. And I think that a lot of scientists just build that really hard structure. So I think like the Alda Center is great because it starts with improv, but how hard it is to get scientists, I was like, probably physicists harder, to that spot of feeling comfortable and vulnerable, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's part of where that space needs to look like, a safe space for being able to feel vulnerable.
Thank you. Laura, Anthony, what's in your...
I'll pick up on that real quick if it's okay. And I think even before that, you know, we can go back to something more simplistic, is what kind of data, you know, empirical, observational, anecdotal, can we marshal that helps show proof of concept, right? Is all the energy within all these different modes of training that we've been talking about, you know, to Laura's point, how are things shaken out? Because we need some of that quote unquote pilot data in our back pocket to make the case that there's promise here, right? That we are making some sort of meaningful differences, and to then therefore earn the capital to basically look for these resources to say, you need to let us play more, you need to let us experiment more to see how we can iterate and make this better. Dietram Schwefla, in an article he wrote recently, you know, called this out very specifically, and I just loved it. And he said, you know, in order for science communication to get better, we need to have license to try new things and fail and try again. And I mean, I think that's really important in this context. And I want to use this real quickly as an opportunity to also plus one something Laura just said, was to introduce the concept, is to zoom the conversation out a little bit from science communication training and fellowship and education, and think more about that all of these things we're talking about exist in much, much bigger systems and cultures. And they're one could argue that we're already in some situations experiencing a ceiling effect where we're not able to actually expand and improve our science communication training efforts because we're butting up against systems and cultures that aren't ready for this change. So I think that ceiling effect is something important for us to keep in mind too.
Thank you, Anthony.
Can I add one word just real quick? Just thank you for hosting this. I think this question about the legitimacy of the field of science communication, both in terms of research and practice, it's important to have a forum like this and more. And I think it helps us professionalize more and more this field and bring it to the table. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. And thank you for inviting us, Brooke, for hosting this.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everybody. Okay, well, yeah, round of applause to our great panelists and to all the great chat that's happening on the side. We got to a number of the elements and a lot of the great questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to them all, but we can continue the conversation in the chat. The session is ending in just a few seconds, and just a preview of what's ahead. This is your chance to stretch your legs and take a little bit of break, check your email, do a few things. We're reconvening with the next session at 35 past the hour. So you've got a half an hour break right now before we reconvene for the final sessions of our SciPEP conference. So thank you to our panelists and thanks to everybody here.